Hello, movie lovers. Welcome home. My name is Amy Henserling, and you are listening to Watch This List Unplugged. This is my 7th episode of Amy's Progress, and Seth Troyer and I are going to be talking about an infamous, crazy, underrated film, The Ninth Configuration by William Peter Blatty. I am very delighted to have Seth with me. And despite the fact that he was my first podcast that I was ever on in my life, Seth and I have never talked until today, one-on-one, I have realized. So
I know we've always had these elephants in the room, and we got
always
them
had
out.
other people. And this is kind of nice to be able to chat one-on-one. Actually, it feels very different.
Yeah, I like it as well. Sometimes we have our comments back and forth on Letterboxd between us, but it still feels like the world is watching us, and it's just us now. It's just us now, me and Amy, which I always thought would be a kind of, I don't know. We have a good time on like chatting on Letterboxd and things because I think I've always found that it's interesting. Our dynamic is kind of interesting that I gravitate towards very like kind of wacky, sometimes wacky for the sake of just wackiness, which I don't know that you're always like on board with what like the movie that I'm posting, but you're always like appreciating where I'm coming from or something.
The way it's your way of doing it that I love, your style,
which I think is what something like Letterboxd or just talking with people about movies rather than just being in a vacuum and watching them in a vacuum. Yeah, like it's more interesting, even if at the end of it you're still like, I don't really feel that way, but like I want that interaction and communication. Like that's what they should be for. It's how you get to know people, I think, is through art, right?
Well, and I think honestly, when I don't know if you relate to this, but the people whose reviews I like the most, it actually ends up having nothing to do with the film. It's that I want to know what they think about it, and I literally enjoy just them, like their personality, what they think. They could be writing about a movie that I absolutely hate, and then when I'm done, I'm like, I kind of don't hate that movie anymore. That to me is more powerful than just like, I just want to read reviews about this film.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
I mean, yeah, someone actually feeling something about a movie is so much more interesting to hear about than someone like regurgitating something that everybody can probably see that the lighting is fucking awesome or something. It's just, I don't know. And yeah, it's wild. Yeah, some of the things I've read on Letterboxd have been like made me cry. Just like people talking about growing up in like mental institutions or like issues that they had with their family, and this I'm like have to keep on reminding myself that I'm reading Freddy Krueger 4 or something review, and like, oh yeah, I forgot. But this movie in particular is really one of those for me. It is very personal, and it is still very obscure. I like, even though it's by the guy who did The Exorcist, he wrote The Exorcist at least, William Peter Blatty. It is still very underseen, even in this era of everything getting rediscovered, everything seemingly having a cult following, which it does definitely, but it still feels rather buried. And I think partially because of it's where it lands religiously. It is from a Catholic believer, and it kind of lands there despite being like a very much rated R, like intense, absurdist, like Thomas Pynchon level, like just weird Dark Night of the Soul kind of thing.
You actually compared it to Magnolia in your review, which I think is spot on, not just in terms of like the sort of controlled insanity, but also like I like how you pointed out that this person had a vision and it was very clear to them, and they're the only person that could have made it. I think that is so true for not just like Exorcist 3, I do feel that way too, that he had a sense of ownership, and his personality is in it, and like his heart and soul are in it. But for this one, it's like nobody would have made this movie. And the fact that like he got this many actors on board, such an excellent ensemble on board to go with him when it's such a crazy plot and this crazy dialogue that goes on is amazing. I feel that way about Magnolia too, because PTA was like 27 when he made it, and he's got like PSH and Julianne Moore and John C. Reilly and like these, like Philip Baker Hall. Like, how did he convince these people? But they must have felt the conviction of the vision in order to have agreed to it, which I think is
Right.
amazing. Just starting off,
Which again goes back to our point about like that is greater than just some movie with a plot, you know. And if you can
exactly.
feel that in the actual making of a movie, that will just you will feel like you are, oh, I'm actually talking to a person, which that's what these things should be. Like you're in direct dialogue and someone is like kind of letting you in and sharing something very personal. And this is like, yeah, it is like a similar to Magnolia. I do view it as like this public breakdown or something like that someone is having in front of you, because it is very, it's like a Frankenstein's monster, which is good to bring up because there's a lot of allusions to like old Universal horror and creepy castles. It all takes place in a creepy castle, but I'm not going to get sidetracked about that because it's a movie that at the end, you know, like I won't spoil the whole thing, but at least at the beginning of the podcast, I know we will eventually. But it is like it proves the existence of God basically at the end of the movie. And
Yeah.
so you'd be like, I might be rushing to my evangelical mom to watch this with her if I just knew that. But the journey to get there is full of bizarre, like absurdist, again, like postmodern, like literary kind of darkness and absurdism, and like there's a really intense bar fight and suicide. So it's just like, who is it for? You know, again, like the like spirituality would put off like an atheist art audience, and
Hmm.
again, my mom would never sit through this fucking thing, you know.
It's like when you see Magnolia, it's the same sensation. Or even like I was talking to you about Kaufman earlier. Adaptation and I'm Thinking of Ending Things are both movies where it's like, who is this for? I mean, ultimately, I think it's for them. I mean, they are these creators like Kaufman, Anderson, Blatty are wrestling with something that is very real to them, and they are kind of vomiting it up in a very structured way. You know, it's like there's parameters because it's a film. So but it is like a very like renewal by like you're transforming your sort of existential crisis into a product that somebody can look at and get something out of, which I think is like, you know, what art, the miracle that art can do is that, like the transformative power of harnessing your own idiosyncrasies into something that's somewhat coherent and accessible to others.
Yeah, I mean, Blatty was. I saw an interview with him. He wrote comedy, and this is a very funny movie. He like wrote Shot in the Dark, I think it was one of the Pink Panther movies, and
Yeah,
a few
the
other
sequel.
comedies before he came to The Exorcist. Um, and this movie, right? And they are like, well, this is a way more funny movie than Exorcist. It is like, yeah, the first hour of this movie is kind of like Looney Tunes, bonkers, like airplane, like quotable, like Napoleon Dynamite level quotable silliness. But
Mm-hmm.
he said in an interview that I was reading that at a certain point, you're wondering like what you're really giving to the world with your work. And it seemed like there was a quite an about face of just like, I don't want to just be working. I want to be like giving something. I don't want to just be
Useful.
doing a job. And I think he did it like kind of like drove the thing into the ground basically with these three films. Like Exorcist was very successful and fits into more of a genre where and it begins this trilogy. Actually, they are a trilogy of films, like The Exorcist, Ninth Configuration, which only has a little, like, one of the characters who's an astronaut, who sort of winds up being, he goes up to space and he thinks that there's nothing there, and he has a breakdown, and he is going to, he's one of the patients at this mental ward in this castle. He is actually in Exorcist for like 1 second, and he's like one of the people at this party where Reagan comes down and pisses on the floor and says, "You're gonna die up there," which is, he's gonna go. He's an astronaut. He's
To the
gonna go up
moon.
there. Yeah, very prophetic. But that's like it. But obviously, thematically, they're drawn together. And then, of course, the third is Exorcist 3, The Legion, which is the only other movie other than Ninth Configuration that Blatty actually directed.
Correct.
And again, like, it all goes back to, like, I think Blatty is having that, like, public breakdown with all of, like, these movies, especially Ninth and Exorcist 3, that he's like, he didn't have a lucrative career as a director. Like, I think he kind of drove it into the ground, like, kind of isolating people. Like, even with Exorcist 3 fits a little bit more into, like, okay, but it's like closer to like a Kubrick movie than a horror, like a regular horror movie or
Like a
something.
police procedural. It's very, yeah. It's more police procedural thriller than horror at times.
Yeah,
Most of the time. Yeah.
and very
Almost
surreal.
like what's the guy's name who did Presumed Innocent? He does a lot of those types of Pakula, Alan J. Pakula. There's a director that does like where it's like a very you're trying to figure something out, and it's a cop that's the main character as opposed to, and there's a supernatural activity going on, but it is sort of tertiary. It's not the main point. It's like
Right.
underlining. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the greater mystery is not the murder, it's the mystery of, like, forgiveness, or if God exists, or if evil can be accounted for. And that is also the truth in the Ninth Configuration, which is it's not a detective story. It's the main character is going into this like madhouse castle for Vietnam veterans, who have had various degrees of mental issues after the war, and he is a psychiatrist, like, so at least we are perceived that way. There are various twists that change everything, but he starts the movie as a psychiatrist in their eyes, and he is trying to, basically, he's investigating both madness, and he's winds up investigating the existence of God, or if there is anything worth living for. Which, yeah, this opens up the movie into this madhouse cast of all these wild characters. Like, they include, like, the one guy who plays the priest in The Exorcist plays one of the
Jason
veterans.
Miller.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's doing a Hamlet play with dogs.
Yeah.
That's just one character in here, and they all have these things. There's Black Superman, who's always dressed as Superman and just in the
It's like
background.
Mystery Men in a way, where it's like these hodgepodge of
that's so good. Yeah.
Colorful characters who show up with like varying degrees of delusional superpowers or gifts.
And it's just a storm of quippy, ridiculous, like, absurdist lines. And there's also this extra plot line of it that is, it's insinuated that the army might also be interested in these patients because they are hiding something or faking being mad. So there's, like, conspiracy behind it, like all these, like, sort of masks behind masks, like people are acting crazy or faking crazy. And there's also this idea of that they are sort of, they're play acting. There's like, every once in a while they'll round a corner and they'll be like, "Do you think he bought it?" Like, they're talking to the psychiatrist Kane, and they're like, "Do you think he bought it?" Or there's all these whispers throughout the whole thing, that there's something being pulled off, sort of.
And then midway, so to sort of give everybody an idea, since this is something that's not widely known, what's happening is that there's this Gothic castle, like Seth said, in Budapest, that looks like Dracula's, and that they're all these mental patients are sequestered and isolated so that they can act out their tendencies sort of safely. But they're bringing in Stacy Keach's character, which is a psychiatrist who is going to help them. And then we are introduced to all of these various characters. And they do give like these crazy one-liners. They're constantly referencing old films like Gregory Peck and Spellbound. They reference Bette Davis, Casablanca. They're talking about literature. Obviously, they bring up Shakespeare. Like he says, "Et tu, White Fang." That was a line that I loved.
That's so
because
good.
they're doing Shakespeare with dogs.
In regard to the setting, they're like, Kane asks, "Do you think that the castle is conducive to mental health?" And it's like, Dracula asked that as well.
Right.
Just again,
so
like every single line at a certain point is like this. Yeah.
It's like a reference to something else. But then when the movie sort of shifts and it's like, oh, things are not exactly what they seem. There are things that it's actually more manipulated and contrived than you think. Like it's more organized chaos than you would assume based on how it's sort of unfolded. Then it turns into, okay, what are we trying to get to here? And then it's a little bit more clear. I would say around the hour mark, it becomes more clear what Blatty's trying to get at.
Yeah, at least beginning with the idea that, again, we're not sure that this is schizophrenia or some specific pathology. It seems like this is more a place for people who have been broken by the world and their worldview has been shattered. For instance, the astronaut who thinks that there's nothing up there, so he's not going to go up in the rocket. He thinks we're alone on Earth and he's afraid of death. And so therefore, he and many of the other patients just see the world as meaningless and it's an absurd lark. So they're just constantly running around a castle all day, just being fucking absurd. Which is sort of the postmodern malaise without meaning, and which usually, there is meaning without God. It's just you have to create it yourself. But these are characters who seem to be unable to do that. So they're just running around and being fucking absurd because life is absurd and they don't know what to do with it.
So would you say, when you're watching them sort of trying to, do you see these characters as people that are trying to reconcile that, or do you see them as characters who've given up and just and they're not thinking about it critically anymore? They've just accepted what they perceive as true and then they've let it go.
I think it's hard because there's I would say there is the more personal thing for them, and then there's the conspiracy, which is that they are in on, which is sort of pulling one off on the psychiatrist, quote unquote, who is actually one of the madmen that they're aware of and everything. But there's also, I think, they are kind of lost souls and they've given up. I think most of them, or they don't, they don't think there's any meaning or hope. So they just proceed they just kind of are proceeding at random at a certain point.
So then there's levels here. There's there are the sane people who are sort of the military people, who are exercising a certain amount of control. And then there is the Kane, who is the main character and is actually questioning and grappling with things. He's not just unconsciously going through the motions. He is trying to ask questions along with Scott Wilson's character, the astronaut character. They are actually trying. And then there's the other level, which is these people are it's meaningless, and I don't care. Like,
Hmm.
I'm not like in pain about the meaninglessness. I'm like, I accept it, I embrace it, and it's fine. So
Right. It
I
does look
think that,
fun at a certain point. Yeah.
right, because they've just completely but I mean, part of the reason that I think perhaps that it's fun is because they're not suffering on account of it. Like, it'd be easier not to ask questions about the existence of evil or God if not asking those questions has zero consequence. Like, of course, why would you ask those questions if you're not in pain of any sort?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And it is kind of interesting. And I feel it goes back to my own upbringing, which I was brought up in like an evangelical household. And I often, it was a kind of novel to finally go to high school and meet some kids that were just, they were never brought up with any kind of spirituality. They
Mm-hmm.
were like atheist parents or something. And it was just always just like, why are you asking me all these questions about God? Like, what is this like preoccupation? Like, it's just interesting that there is this sort of just, I'm not, yeah. I wonder if it is that it is more that it comes from my background that I actually gravitate and worry about that question so much, like specifically God. Of course, atheists are grappling with like existence and what does it mean and everything. Um, but there comes a point of that I do think I value that I was brought up with spirituality because it does add that intensity to my journey. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and like it lights a fire. I've had a fire under me to like, no, I need to like really think about that and really like, which I'm not saying that atheists or people who are brought up atheists don't have that necessarily. I think it's just interesting that, yeah, I just, that was at a very early age. I was like at 6 years old being like, I am thinking about the greater ethical and spiritual consequences of my actions, which, yeah, that's wild and important, but maybe something that was too much for me at a certain age. But yeah, as
It's almost
for
that sense of urgency. It's like almost like fast tracking you to have a midlife crisis as a 6-year-old
yeah,
where you're coming to consciousness about something that perhaps would, I don't know, it's interesting to think about things being formative as opposed to things being thrust upon you via circumstance or like via crises or a tragedy, because a lot of times it's like something will happen. That's why typically it's midlife
mm,
where people start gravitating towards these questions, because for a lot of like people's lives perhaps something doesn't isn't a catalyst for that, but when you're grown up, when you're brought up that way, you're sort of doing it preemptively, and then you have way more time to decide whether you want to believe it or not, as opposed to maybe something happening in your life where you wouldn't choose it, you would just sort of naturally go one way or the other.
yeah. I mean that it does seem like this movie came about in Blatty's midlife, and it does feel like that. It is again someone reaching, which that is interesting, and it sounds like that's sort of a journey that's going on for you a little bit, from what you've shared with me about. I know you did come up in the church a little bit in your background, right? And you're
Oh
sort of
yeah.
reassessing through your journey right now, which is like later in your life.
You have to at some point, I think, or at least me, I had to make a decision whether it was mine, because when you're raised in the church or raised in any sort of religion, um you don't necessarily know if it's something you would have chosen
Hmm.
yourself, because you, as a child, you weren't necessarily given a choice. So as an adult person, unless you completely disregard it entirely, which is difficult to do when it's in there, um you kind of have to decide, like, what am I going to do with this? Because it doesn't really go away, right?
It doesn't seem to. Yeah, I always
Yeah.
think it's going to, as much as I have fallen from the faith and become closer to agnostic to atheist, I guess. I have like a optimistic atheist or something at this point. But it still is pretty ingrained in me, and if anything, like even on just an aesthetic level, I am drawn to things like specifically like Christianity and Catholicism and that search and that guilt and that, I don't know, yeah, still get caught up in all that. Although I
Right.
do tend to gravitate, since getting to know different kinds of perspectives and things, that yeah, there's like a very climactic moment where it's like a dream sequence that features the astronaut in this movie, and you don't necessarily know if it actually happened or what, but it's like a dream that he's on the moon and he turns around and there is uh, uh, Jesus on a crucifix on the moon, and it's a very surreal image and you're not sure what to do with it. The whole time there's this voiceover coming from Kane talking about how like it's basically the ninth configuration. It explains the title of the movie, which is
Yes.
the number of, I forget what, like cells or
Proteins.
chromosomes,
Yeah.
proteins.
Yeah. The world basically was most, like, based on mathematics, was most likely not able to be by chance.
Yes.
That's the ninth configuration idea.
Yeah, which it would take like something in the billion year process for that to actually have any sort
Uh-huh.
of possibility of happening,
Right.
human
Right.
existence or life on Earth as we know it.
It's
And
the whole prime mover idea, Aquinas. It's the thing about the proofs, the 5 proofs of God, where it's like you had to have sort of an origin just based on nature alone. I think it's kind of that in line with that philosophy or idea.
which it's a common thing, and like the same. I don't know. It's interesting that like size of the universe and all the possibilities is always like, oh, it's weaponized by both sides as being the explanation for where they stand.
Uh-huh.
Which it's like a very much just a perceptual shift of just like the the galaxy is so vast and impossibly huge and impossibly complex. How could there not be some god who made it, right? And
Mhm.
that is where people stand on one side, and then the other side, which I have started to like kind of just fall in that way of just like, without the need and assumption that there is this like idea of a prime mover and a creation, like
Mhm.
idea that there's some sort of like we have to anthropomorphize the galaxy and the universe and everything that's here because everything has to sort of mirror us. The idea of like there just being a lot of numbers that you have to bypass is like that is the argument that some people bring up as like, I mean, it's not that difficult for me to grasp that. It's just very unlikely, but it did happen, right? Just like these
But
math equations I don't find as daunting. And yeah, I don't know, it's all about where you kind of like fall, I guess.
do you feel like for either view that one would have, that there is a bit of a leap of faith required in a certain sense of, like, sort of saying, like, I don't know and I can't know to a certain extent? Because I think a lot of times there is that um preoccupation with trying to make two distinct sides, where it's like, well, this side of a group of people have to make a leap of faith and this side don't, because they're right and they're rational, or they're like, they have proof. But I do think even the way that you're phrasing it now, and this is just my take on it, is like you would kind of have to admit that you don't know everything in either side, and
I
that
think
there's things that are beyond you.
that's definitely understood, especially on the non-spiritual side is very much like, yes, it's an ongoing process. Science is an ongoing process and everything like that. I guess I always just fall into anymore with the like just like a chicken or the egg kind of thing. Like I wonder if we would even like worry so much about this if we didn't have this, especially in the Western world, this preoccupation with creationism and this like we're just so stuck on that. But it is like this assumption that doesn't necessarily need to be there. Like when you like enter nature, I feel like it's a very it just feels so intrinsically like a human preoccupation when we're talking
It's
about something that
interesting.
is greater than the human, which is like, yeah, like the ninth configuration, blah, 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 billions of years, like something huge outside of me. I don't know why I suddenly have to counteract that or argue that. There's like this assumption that you need to argue that it's not, that it's absurd or that it's too convenient or something that life on Earth happened, which is a weird. I think it's a great thing to bring up, and I love that about humans that we are questioning these things. But I think it is a weird. It's weird that we're so in like I don't know, like kind of self. Uh, we're kind of proud of ourselves for having that whole thing of like, yeah, but isn't it convenient? This like, but like, there's no, I don't know. That's the, yeah, I don't know.
So you're saying even in this like podcast conversation, it's you're kind of being meta about it, which I like, because you're basically providing commentary on what we're doing right now, outside of what we're doing, which is that it's interesting that you like humanity as a whole, but also you and I are literally doing this right now. That we would be curious about these things, that we think that there's value in discussing them, that
Mm-hmm.
we have this sort of proclivity or attraction to a greater understanding, especially in how it relates to us. Like it's not even just that Blatty's talking about the existence of God. It's also about like, can we have anything to do with the existence of God? Or is it just this void? And is it just like this, the stars are so lonely out there? That's what Scott Wilson's character says. Like, is it just that there's this blackness that we can't escape and we can't come back from? Or does suffering have meaning? Is there such a thing as sacrificial love? And do we have any connection to that goodness? And that piece is, I think, the preoccupation that we have the most, is whether or not we matter and whether or not meaning can be found with something that created.
Right. Which for me, it usually is. I mean, short of being in a darker place in your life where you are sort of just incapacitated with doubt or like the feeling of meaningless, usually there is meaning, like regardless of if it's like attached to a god or not, or some greater meaning is always the thing that like kind of confuses me. Which I'm just like, whoever said there was like a greater meaning, other than just people that were kind of like pushing and reaching for that specifically, or were like dissatisfied and therefore went forth and tried to find that.
I see what
Um,
you're saying. As a kind of compensation for themselves, like to be like, well, I'm just going through this because there's a greater meaning to my suffering, and therefore like that makes my suffering more bearable. Is that what you mean? Like
yeah, they
sort of
had a
mental gymnastics?
neurosis that they needed to follow, I guess,
Uh-huh.
which is not, I think that's a very specific neurosis that not everyone has, I don't think. I think, or sometimes a lot of us probably just have more of a guilt of feeling like, oh, we need to find like something greater, because we're
Mm.
just like, I think we never grow out of the little kid thing that is just, I don't know, that was helpful to just be like, well, why though? Why though? Why though? Why though? Why though? And like, no matter how good the explanation gets, like we're still just like, why though? Why though? Why though?
Well,
But
so
that was useful
the
for us, right? It was useful. It brought us here.
and the I think that what the film is really asking
Oh yeah, the
in the
movie.
end
Forgot about that.
is that he wants a sign, right? Like he's saying like, okay, you know, Scott Wilson has kind of this rant in the middle where he's saying like, what's the point of suffering? We're just a slaughterhouse. Creation is an open wound. He calls God foot. And he's
I
like,
love that.
maybe God can't interfere in our affairs. And he's like, so I've noticed. So there's this really, really strong skepticism, really, really strong doubt, and moment of like complete breakdown. But then what the movie is ultimately doing is asking for a sign. Like it is saying like, first of all, which Blatty has said himself, that it's about the mystery of goodness and whether or not sacrificial love is possible. And then two, that if the character was given a sign, then all of a sudden all would be well, like all would be on the right path, and he would know. And so that knowing is where the movie ends, because he is given something that's concrete, and then it proceeds from there, which is very different than how The Exorcist 3 ends. So I feel like this is more the third in the trilogy than the middle, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because the way The Exorcist 3 ends is very different.
Yeah, well,
I don't know what you think
they
about
didn't get
that.
the sign, so not everybody got the sign.
Exactly.
We're not all so fortunate, and that's why it's easier for some of us to be believers than others, I think. Because, boy,
that's an interesting statement. So do you feel like if somebody actually that kind of resonated with me, Seth. Do you think that the people who believe are all people who feel that they've been given a sign?
not all of them. That's always the thing. You're kind of, and even they are probably looking themselves in the mirror and like, did you really see something? Did you really have it? And I'm always like, when I'm talking with them, I'm always like, because you're on the other side, so you're skeptical. You didn't see it, so whatever it is. But not all of them. I mean, I think a lot of them are obviously just sort of going through the motions. But I think my my parents have always spoken of it as this thing of like, well, if you had seen what I've seen, or if you had felt what I felt, which is always truth about God or UFOs. It's all like that. It's just like why you can't like fully, and any sort of logic twirling doesn't really help these situations. And that is the thing about it. That's why this movie is like wish fulfillment for Blatty, because I think no believer escapes doubt unless they would. I mean, I like to think that it's also like tied up like in a bow though, right? At the end of the movie, in a way that like probably wouldn't end. It wouldn't end because he would still be like, wow, what was the, and maybe somebody left out there. Maybe, he would have those days. And then he would also have the days where he'd be like, no, I know that like my friend died so that he could prove that there is something beyond death for me, and how wonderful. It's like a beautiful ending for that reason. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like as a person, I'm just, I want a sign. I want more. I'm someone who is, and I don't think it's wrong of me to ask God for more. That's where I usually sit, which the doubting Thomas thing, it always resonated with me. He was the only one. He was, God forbid, he wanted to actually touch the wound, because like, what is this? This is nuts. This is nuts. This guy here saying that he rose from the dead in front of us. All of a sudden, I want to actually touch it. And he was. Jesus applauded him for his doubt. He was the only one who actually touched God. That's the thing. Like,
right.
So I don't know. Some of us just need more, and I don't know if we'll ever get the amount we'll need if there is something actually beyond things.
That's such a fascinating, it reminds me of two things. There's a story in the Bible about the woman who is like basically like on her hands and knees trying to touch Jesus because her daughter is possessed, and he's like, leave me alone, like go away basically. And she's like, no, like she won't. And she keeps coming at him and saying like, please help me, please help me. And then he looks at her and he is like, your faith has made you well, and then heals her daughter. And then she goes away. But it's like basically the opposite of the Thomas thing, where it's like somebody is admired or rewarded for their doubt because they want that proof, and then it's bestowed to them, and then another person is rewarded for that blind faith, in terms of like, this person was so convicted that they would not leave until they got the response that they thought, and then it actually happened in life, like, physically in this example. But then it also makes me think of like how when there is something physical, if there is like proof, then why would you need faith at all to believe, which is something that me and Hutch were talking about with Ordette. It's like, if you've got the resurrection and you can feel the wound and that you know that he came back, what is really required of you anymore?
Right. I mean,
because you can see it.
Which it goes back to, you just did crimes and misdemeanors, and one of the biggest lines that resonated with me was, I forget who said it, but it was the line where someone says we just, as humans, for whatever reason, we just can never conceptualize a God that, I mean, in so many words, doesn't put us through something, or like is like just an all loving God, or doesn't have this like an all accepting God. There's always some sort of thing you have to go through, it seems, which is, I mean, I think it just comes from that ancient school of thought of myth making, which is like, there's got to be a hero's journey. There's got to be this thing that you go
the
through.
Pilgrim's Progress, right?
Right. Which, on one end I get, and I do see, like going out there and working for what is good, but at the same time, like, it's hard, and I get it from atheists when they say like, well, if he knows everything and can just make it all better, like, obviously just make it all better. Like, I question I mean, maybe that's again why I struggle with God and things like that. It's just like, I question the real purpose and merit of going through suffering, or needing to believe even, like, rather than just be here, just talk, be here with me, God, already, and like, don't put me through all this, like this.
Like, have basically that you're talking about, like, not having tests, not being tested.
Yeah.
Not being sort of having to endure or persevere through situations in order to come at the other side of something.
Right, which even at the end of this movie is a journey through suicide, which the main character, Kane, he's going into the unknown, basically. He is being the astronaut shooting himself into the darkness, which he stabs himself and dies so that he can figure out if there's something on the other end of death and leave a sign for Cutchaw.
And he calls it like shock that has curative value. They bring that up a couple of times where it's like he's trying to get at extremes in order to heal. But I think it's telling that the movie, even if it has that like messianic bend to it, like him carrying him down the stairs is even reminiscent. It's like taking him off the cross and carrying him. So there's so much symbolism and allegory here, but then it doesn't end there. It ends with the sign, which to me is coming back to the resurrection is the point that you're coming to what is the physical manifestation that something actually happened, as opposed to ending on death or ending on the violent nature of something. And Blatty, I'm sure, did that very intentionally.
Right, because it seems like that is the unavoidable aspect to these things. Like, the path to God, for whatever reason, is blocked. The path to wisdom is blocked, it seems. Whatever it is that we're trying to get to, transcendence, it seems like we have to go through such toil, which, is true. And we can see examples in everyday life. Like, everything we do, we have to invest ourselves in order to get something out of it. It is just, I understand the bitterness that people have about a God that is apparently advertising all-knowing, all-powerful nature. Like, maybe you can remedy that. I don't actually love going through all this, toil and pain. Not, I mean, I can find meaning in it. I have to find meaning in it to go forward, right? And these characters have to do so as well. But I'd be fine if you just solved it. I would be fine with that. That would be nice.
Do you think that the idea of this could be, I mean, if you were trying to understand it from the opposite end and not thinking of it in terms of us being the center, that perhaps if this is the case, then it could be that God or a higher power or what have you would be viewing suffering differently than we do, and that there is perhaps an aspect of it that we don't understand or don't have access to, and therefore that's why. Like, could it possibly be a matter of perspective and a matter of like right sizing ourselves? Because it's like a lot of those musings, I think, are just making us so important in the grand scheme of things, and maybe we just aren't.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a podcast about crimes and misdemeanors, but again, there's like the guy who commits suicide in that movie, who is like this like big intellectual who gives them a lot of hope. He does say that the hope that future generations will know more, and that's like an easy way of shutting the book, right? Is just like, which a lot of it is just hoping that someone understands all this, or someone will understand all this, or there's a God somewhere that can understand all this and make it so that the Holocaust makes sense in a greater like scheme of getting of wisdom and transcendence of an entire human race or whatever. It's just that hope, because otherwise it is very like, yeah,
It's impossible. I mean,
it's just
really, it's
there is
impossible to
chaos then that you
reconcile.
just have to sort of live with, that there is
Exactly.
chaos, and that is
Right.
also a thing we must do.
Bleak.
It's bleak, but it's also, if it is reality, it is reality. We have to face that.
Right.
Uh,
Do you think that in to some extent that the questions that the movie is grappling with are things that should be asked? Or do you watch this movie and think this is pointless? Like, which you, Seth, when you watch this now, like, I know that you'd seen it before and that this movie resonates with you because of your context and your personal life. When you watch it now, do you think there's just no point, or do you find yourself still being in this mindset, whether you sort of consciously are or not? And do you find any merit in it?
I find merit. I think I'm just different characters at different points in my life, and I think anyone who says
Mm-hmm.
that they are like one or the other in one place, they're never going to stay in that place. Like, so a lot of the time, I feel like I am like one of the people in the hallways running around in a silly outfit, just being, all the world's a stage and it's just all silly and for like Dionysian whatnot, just having a
Mm-hmm.
wild, absurd time, because what does anything mean except for what we make here? And then of course there's like, it's worthwhile for me when I lose that, because I lose that sometimes, and then I have to sort of be Kane and be investigating and find the thread and find the plot again. Again, like, it helps to divorce it from its specific Christian undertones, to see it as just a seeker wanting to seek. With Kane, I think is important. Although it is like, it's probably wrong to divorce it from that, because that is like, the greater thing is that this is personal for Blatty specifically. But as far as me as an audience member, it's obviously worthwhile, like, to not just choose darkness. It's worthwhile to find a way of making things matter to you, or making your day matter, so that you go out and face it. And for some people, like, God is what helps them do that, or some sort of path, some sort of
Mm.
structure helps them do that. So yeah, I think, yeah, regardless of what it is, I am happy for the person who finds that.
Okay, I understand. So you're saying that there is value. It's just a matter of like different seasons, shall we say?
Mm-hmm.
'Cause that's a word that's used a lot that I used to hear all the time in my life. It's like, well, this is that season. This is the season of searching, and this is the season of like indulging, and this is the season of like, you know, when you're younger, it's much easier to just be selfish and to think about what you gain and manipulate people and whatever. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that you're just like kind of unconsciously or blindly going through because you're forming your identity then, right? And I think a lot of times maybe these sorts of films end up coming out in midlife of the creator, and then also the characters are in the middle of their lives for a reason, because they've lived long enough to have formed an identity that needs to be questioned.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you're younger, it's not cemented yet to where you can even chip away at it, because you don't have like that raw material. It'd be like a sculptor that doesn't have a block of stone. I mean, you need something to analyze before you can come to a greater understanding of what it even is, or even your ability to shape it. It's got to be there first.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times that's unexplored territory for people. And then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, who am I? Why am I here? All of a sudden comes up later.
Oh,
for a lot of us.
for sure. And I think the real thing is you're just going to keep doing that. Ideally with less
Yes.
intensity, maybe, or ideally you have more and more tools after every time it happens to deal with the next one.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Yeah, and I
Inescapable.
think it's also the voices that you sort of seek out. Like, who are you listening to? Who's informing you? What life experiences are you having that are contributing or not contributing to the more authentic self? Because a lot of this is like figuring out who Kane is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the entire film is structured on these two characters having access to themselves. It's like everything needs to be stripped away and dealt with in order to come to who these people are, so that they can either move forward or die, basically. And one character moves forward and one of them dies.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that he's literally in a bubble of denial too, Kane. He's like he's created a whole other human being to slip inside and believe
Yeah.
that he is for a while. Which sometimes you got to do that, I guess. You're but idea, because that is the toss up. There is like the want for authenticity and truth, which and there's also just like what works, what is going to actually just work for you, which I think that goes into explaining his denial is like the negative end. And also there's like ideas of faith, of just like, okay, I can't fully find like all the answers here, but I need this, and this is what's going to work for me, and belief in a deity uh, who knows more than me, and just letting it be there or whatever. That helps me, and that is what works for me. Because yeah, sometimes I feel like sort of that's sort of the misconception, that you're like trying to find truth, and you are ideally, but at the same time it's just like you're just trying to find a way that you can create a self that works. And like ideally you're not a totally like inauthentic person. Nobody wants that. But yeah, you might not have
Mm-hmm.
like the like airtight perfect like explanation for everything.
Well, and I think in the interesting thing for me in where I'm at is that the process that I'm going through is literally called recovery. And the reason it's called recovery is because you are going off of the assumption that there's something already there. You're not trying to create a new self. You're trying to have access to a self that's been buried.
Mm-hmm.
You're literally recovering. So I think that's a crucial distinction in my mind, because it's not that I need to find myself. It's that there is this self that's just been covered in all this muck and all this falseness and all this fake coping defense mechanisms that didn't serve me and didn't do anything at all. But if you can detach and remove those things and identify them for what they are, and then recognize in yourself that tendency, what you find is something that was already there, as opposed to something that you have to go figure out how to make be there. So to me, that's the powerful thing. Like, you can talk about God, you can talk about all these lofty ideas, you can talk about space, how the world was created, but in the end, we are self-obsessed, and we do want to know who we are. And if you can figure that out and then express your passion in a way that's useful to others, I don't think any of these particulars matter that much.
Sure.
It's just
that's great.
It's just figuring out what's blocking you, like what's in your way, and like how can you get rid of it.
Yeah, that's great. That's absolutely the deal. And yeah, whether God plays into it or answers plays into it at all, or science plays into it, fine. But yeah, we are born, I think, with some kind of core. I think people who are more spiritual want to use like the word soul or something maybe, but I like the word core, that there is something like deeper in us that is consistent and is the thing that almost feels like it's already formed almost, and you're just trying to give it more context and give it more light and growth and things like that. That's great. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on, Seth.
And the AA and all that, you're doing the AA thing in Akron, Ohio.
Shout out.
Yeah, we tried. We're trying to help you, everything we do.
Trying to help the masses.
Oh yeah. No, I'm glad we could talk about this movie. This movie means a lot to me. Yeah, like I had like a quintessential cool uncle who showed this movie to me.
Yes.
And it absolutely reflects him in my eyes, like his specific humor, and also he was like, I was always presented with like my atheist friends, and then there's my Christian family who are just like, very much just blind believers. And then he was more of a discerning, he believed that there was a God, but he was always searching and always more in like this gray space. He experimented with this and that. And he also struggled with mental health also, which is interesting, like tie in with this movie and everything, which I don't know. Yeah, I always think of him with this, and how he was one of the people who definitely set me on a course to try and have a more wider understanding, not settle.
Right. And maybe not close our ears. Like, maybe not just assume that, like, there's I can't remember who this is by, but it's like taking life lightly, like not being so precious with what we think that we can't be reached. And that we allow life to speak to us and people to speak to us. And there's like this posture of, I don't know, openness, so that people can affect us, and that like we're not just so afraid that we have to cling to what we think, because the consequence of not doing so is just so frightening. And I think that's what I'm trying to learn how to do, is just think less of myself in a healthy way. It's not like thinking less of myself, thinking of myself less.
Yeah, that seems to be the big thing as everyone gets older, whether that's manifested. The classic thing is you have kids or something, and that is like everyone says it's like, oh, suddenly not about me. That's the relief, and that's what they want. But more, yeah, there are other avenues outside of that, right? And it's like it being, yeah, as you get older, this whole self, you ideally find your core, find yourself, and try and hold on to that and solidify it. But yeah, I like it would be nice to just worry about other things. You're like, ideally, your whole life
Yeah.
is not just this constant search and constant anxiety about like, who am I? What is the world? What is this? Who are the people I love and all this? Ideally, things solidify here and there, and we have stasis from time to time. Understanding that
And then you
stasis
can just
breaks,
be
but
present.
mhm.
Yeah, like you can just like focus on what you're doing, like literally, like at any given moment you are there and you're listening, and the person has your attention, and you are like, I am open to what happens, and I can hear what's going on because there's not all this stuff in the way. That's what I'm saying. Like, I think
Mhm.
the unblocking is so important so that you're not in denial about your own self, and then you can receive things. But it's really hard to do that when you can't even see past your own what's in the way.
Your para personality that you developed because of trauma in the Vietnam War, that
Yeah,
is you
your
thinking you're your
survival.
own brother so that you can distance yourself from beheading someone. You know,
Yep,
we can all relate to
all of us. It's not specific at all.
that. No.
uh well, everybody, I hope that you have found this conversation meaningful and edifying, and
I did.
please see the ninth configuration, because this movie is wild. And then I will link Seth's review, because that is the catalyst for what caused this. Is I was so moved by
Aw,
what he wrote and his style. It's true, Seth, and everybody should read it even if they don't watch this crazy film. But I hope that people watch it and get something out of it.
go forth.
Yes, and we'll see you at the movies.
Yeah, we'll see you.